The mahogany doors of the courtroom swung open with a sound that seemed to slice through the very fabric of justice itself, and in walked Madison Ashford, daughter of Governor Richard Ashford, as if she owned not just the room, but the laws that governed it. If you believe privilege should never shield anyone from accountability, hit that like button right now. The air inside Judge Elias Monroe's courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that makes breathing feel like a conscious effort. Light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches, illuminating dust particles that hung suspended like tiny witnesses to what was about to unfold. The gallery was packed, shoulder to shoulder, with journalists, concerned citizens, and those who had followed the case with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. At the center of it all sat Judge Monroe, his silver hair catching the afternoon light, his weathered face an unreadable mask of judicial patience. His eyes, though, those dark, penetrating eyes that had seen 3 decades of truth and lies, they missed nothing. Madison Ashford was 28 years old, though her demeanor suggested someone who had never truly been required to grow up. She moved through the courtroom in a designer suit that cost more than most families earned in 6 months, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that announced her importance. Her lawyer, Marcus Pemberton, one of the most expensive defense attorneys money could buy, walked beside her with the confidence of someone who had made careers out of making problems disappear. Behind them sat Governor Ashford himself, his face carefully neutral, though his hands gripped the edge of the bench with white-knuckled intensity. The charges were devastating: vehicular manslaughter while driving under the influence, leaving the scene of an accident, and obstruction of justice. 3 months earlier, Madison had been driving her Maserati through a residential neighborhood at nearly 80 miles per hour, her blood alcohol level later measured at more than twice the legal limit. She had run a red light at the intersection of Maple and 7th, colliding with a sedan carrying the Torres family. Miguel Torres, his wife Elena, and their 7-year-old daughter Sophia. Miguel had died instantly. Elena had survived with severe injuries that would require years of physical therapy. Sophia, strapped in her car seat in the back, had suffered traumatic brain injury and remained in a pediatric rehabilitation facility, learning to walk and speak again. But what made the case even more unconscionable was what happened next. Security footage from nearby businesses showed Madison stumbling from her vehicle, looking at the wreckage, and then making a phone call before walking, not running, away from the scene. Within 30 minutes, a team of her father's security personnel had arrived, along with a lawyer. By the time police reached the scene, Madison was nowhere to be found. It took investigators 4 days to officially bring her in for questioning. 4 days during which evidence could be managed, stories could be aligned, and influence could be exercised. Judge Monroe's gavel came down with a sharp crack that commanded immediate silence. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority without needing to be raised. "The people versus Madison Claire Ashford. Will the defendant please rise?" Madison stood slowly, almost leisurely, as if she was doing the court a favor by acknowledging its existence. Her expression held not fear, not remorse, not even concern, but something closer to boredom tinged with irritation, as if these proceedings were an inconvenient interruption to her actual life. The prosecutor, District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, was a woman in her 40s who had built her reputation on refusing to be intimidated by wealth or power. She had turned down 3 lucrative offers from private firms to continue serving public justice. As she stood to present the case, the folder in her hands was thick with evidence that had taken months to compile, despite every obstacle thrown in her path. "Your Honor," Walsh began, her voice steady and clear, "the evidence will show that on the evening of March 15th, the defendant made a conscious choice to get behind the wheel of a vehicle while severely intoxicated. She made a conscious choice to drive at reckless speeds through a residential area where families live, where children play. And when her choices resulted in catastrophic consequences, the death of Miguel Torres, a devoted father and husband, and life-altering injuries to Elena and Sofia Torres, the defendant made yet another conscious choice: to flee the scene, to use her family's resources to evade immediate accountability, and to show absolutely no remorse for the destruction she caused. Marcus Pemberton rose with practiced smoothness. "Your Honor, the defense acknowledges that a tragic accident occurred, but that's precisely what it was, an accident. My client has struggled with anxiety and was taking prescribed medication that may have interacted poorly with a single glass of wine at a charity dinner. She was disoriented after the collision, in shock, and the prosecution's characterization of her actions as callous is both inaccurate and inflammatory. Ms. Ashford comes from a family dedicated to public service, and she herself has contributed countless hours to charitable causes. This is a young woman with her entire life ahead of her, a future that would be destroyed by the excessive charges being pursued here." Judge Monroe's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that suggested he had heard countless variations of this argument before, and none of them had impressed him. "The court will hear the evidence," he said simply. "Ms. Walsh, you may present your case." What followed was 3 hours of methodical, devastating testimony. The responding officer described the scene: the Torres family's sedan crumpled like paper, shattered glass coating the intersection like deadly snow, Miguel Torres already gone, his wife screaming for her daughter, blood everywhere. Forensic experts presented evidence of the Maserati's speed based on skid marks and impact analysis. The toxicology report was entered into evidence, showing Madison's blood alcohol content of 0.19, more than twice the legal limit. Video footage was played showing Madison's unsteady departure from the scene, her deliberate phone call, her calculated retreat. But the most powerful testimony came from Elena Torres herself. She entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, her left side still weak from the spinal injuries she had sustained. Her face bore the permanent scars of the impact, but her eyes burned with a grief and determination that silenced even the reporters who had been murmuring among themselves. "My husband was a good man," Elena said, her voice breaking, but her words clear. "He worked 2 jobs to give our daughter the life she deserved. He never complained. He never asked for anything except the chance to love his family and build a future for our Sophia. That night we were coming home from her school concert. She had sung a solo. She was so proud. Miguel was so proud. We were laughing, playing her favorite music, and then her voice failed for a moment, and the silence that filled that space was suffocating. Then everything exploded. Glass, metal, pain. I remember screaming for Sophia. I remember seeing Miguel and knowing he was gone. And I remember, before I lost consciousness, seeing a woman walk away. Just walk away, like we were nothing, like my husband's life was nothing, like my daughter's future was nothing. Throughout Elena's testimony, Madison sat with her arms crossed, her jaw set, occasionally whispering to her lawyer, but showing no visible emotion. At one point, when Elena broke down completely, sobbing for the husband who would never come home and the daughter who still asked why Daddy didn't visit her in the hospital, Madison actually glanced at her phone. Judge Monroe saw it. His fingers, which had been steepled before his face, lowered slowly to the bench. His gaze fixed on Madison with an intensity that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. But he said nothing yet. He simply watched. The defense's case was predictably crafted. Pemberton called a toxicologist who suggested that anxiety medication could have amplified the effects of alcohol in unexpected ways. He called character witnesses who testified to Madison's volunteer work and charitable donations. He presented medical records showing she had been treated for anxiety and depression. He even called a trauma specialist who suggested that her decision to leave the scene could have been the result of psychological shock rather than callous disregard. But there was one moment when the carefully constructed defense began to crumble. During cross-examination, D.A. Walsh asked Madison's toxicologist a simple question. "Doctor, you've testified that anxiety medication could have intensified the effects of alcohol. Did Ms. Ashford's prescription include warnings about consuming alcohol while taking this medication?" The toxicologist hesitated. "Well, yes, and according to the medication logs we've obtained, Ms. Ashford had been prescribed this medication for 8 months before the incident. Correct?" "Yes." "So she would have received these warnings multiple times from both her doctor and her pharmacist. That would be standard procedure. And yet she chose to drink anyway. She chose to drink and then drive. Would you say that constitutes a conscious choice to ignore known risks?" The toxicologist's composure faltered. "I can only speak to the medical interaction." "That's all, doctor. Thank you." By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. D.A. Walsh delivered a summation that laid out the evidence with surgical precision, then concluded with words that echoed off the courtroom walls. "This isn't about a mistake. This isn't about an accident. This is about choices. Madison Ashford chose to drink. She chose to drive. She chose to speed through a neighborhood. She chose to run that red light. And when her choices killed a man and destroyed a family, she chose to walk away. She chose to use her privilege to delay justice. She chose, every step of the way, to put herself first. The Torres family didn't get to choose. Miguel Torres didn't get to choose whether to live or die that night. Sofia Torres didn't get to choose whether to have a normal childhood or spend years relearning how to walk. Elena Torres didn't get to choose whether to have her husband by her side or to be a widow at 34. But this court does get to choose. We get to choose whether justice means the same thing for everyone or whether it's something you can buy your way out of if your father happens to be governor. Marcus Pemberton's closing was smooth, polished, and built on a foundation of sympathy. He spoke of second chances, of rehabilitation, of the difference between punishment and destruction. He painted Madison as a troubled young woman who had made a terrible mistake, but who deserved the opportunity to rebuild her life and contribute positively to society. Sending Ms. Ashford to prison for decades doesn't bring Miguel Torres back, he argued. It doesn't heal Sofia Torres. It simply destroys another life, another future. Where is the justice in that? And then came the moment that would be replayed on news channels for weeks. Judge Monroe asked if Madison wished to make a statement before sentencing. Pemberton advised against it, but Madison, perhaps believing her charm and privilege had always worked before, perhaps genuinely convinced of her own immunity from real consequences, stood to speak. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying that particular quality of someone who was used to being listened to, "I want to say that I'm sorry this accident happened. It's been very difficult for my family, having to deal with all these accusations and media attention. My father has dedicated his life to serving this state, and it's been heartbreaking to watch him suffer because of something I didn't intend to happen." She paused, as if waiting for sympathy. "I've always tried to be a good person. I donate to charities. I volunteer. I made a mistake, yes, but I don't think I should have my entire life ruined because of one night. The Torres family lost someone, and that's sad, but destroying my future won't change that. I have so much I want to accomplish. I want to make a difference in the world. I can't do that from prison." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the journalists had stopped typing. Madison, perhaps mistaking silence for support, continued. "And honestly, I think there's been a lot of exaggeration about what happened. The speed estimates are based on assumptions. The blood test could have been compromised. My lawyer has explained all of this. I think this has become a political prosecution because of who my father is. People want to use me to score points against him. But I'm not going to let that happen. I have rights. My family has worked too hard, contributed too much to this state, to be treated like common criminals." There it was. The mask had slipped completely. D.A. Walsh's eyes widened slightly. Pemberton closed his eyes, his face paling. Governor Ashford dropped his head into his hands. Judge Monroe remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Madison, still oblivious, sealed her fate with her final words. "I've tried to be patient with this process, Your Honor, but frankly, I think you need to consider who I am, who my family is, and what we represent. We're not the kind of people who belong in the same category as actual criminals. We're above, we're different from—" She gestured vaguely toward the gallery, toward Elena Torres in her wheelchair, toward the normal citizens who filled the benches. "We're different from them, and I think you should take that into account." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of someone's watch ticking could be heard 3 rows back. Judge Monroe stood slowly, and when he did, every person in that courtroom felt the weight of 3 decades of judicial experience settling over them like a thunderstorm about to break. "Ms. Ashford," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "you have just provided this court with perfect clarity, not about your guilt. That was already established beyond any reasonable doubt by the mountain of evidence presented here. No, you've provided clarity about something far more important, your character, your values, and your understanding of what justice means." He paused, letting his words sink in like stones into deep water. "You stood before this court and apologized not for killing a man, not for destroying a family, but for the inconvenience this has caused your family. You expressed sympathy not for the 7-year-old girl who will spend years learning to walk again, but for your father's political discomfort. You described the death of Miguel Torres, a loving husband and father, as sad, the same word you might use for a cancelled dinner reservation or a disappointing movie." Madison's face began to pale, but Judge Monroe wasn't finished. "And then, Ms. Ashford, you revealed what you truly believe. You argued that you shouldn't be ruined by one night, as if ruination is something that only matters when it happens to you. Miguel Torres was ruined. His life ended completely. Elena Torres was ruined, her body broken, her husband gone, her daughter's future stolen. Sofia Torres was ruined, her childhood, her health, her innocent trust in the safety of the world, all shattered. But their ruination, in your view, is merely sad. Your potential ruination, however, is a tragedy that should outweigh the actual deaths and injuries you caused." The judge's voice grew harder, each word striking like a hammer. "You dismissed the speed analysis as assumptions and questioned the blood test, despite the fact that multiple experts confirmed both, and despite the fact that you were seen by multiple witnesses stumbling and barely able to walk straight. You characterized this prosecution as political, as if holding you accountable for manslaughter while intoxicated is somehow an attack on your father, rather than simply the application of law. And then, Ms. Ashford, you said something that will echo in this courtroom long after you're gone." Judge Monroe leaned forward, his eyes boring into Madison with an intensity that made her step back involuntarily. "You said you and your family are different from them." You gestured toward the gallery, toward ordinary citizens, toward Elena Torres, the woman whose husband you killed, and you declared yourself above her, better than her, different from her. You suggested that this court should consider who you are and what your family represents when determining your sentence. You actually asked me to give you preferential treatment based on your privilege, based on your father's position, based on your belief that you are fundamentally superior to the people whose lives are governed by the same laws you think shouldn't fully apply to you. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. "Ms. Ashford, let me tell you who you are. You are a woman who chose to drink excessively. You are a woman who chose to drive while intoxicated. You are a woman who chose to speed through a residential neighborhood. You are a woman who chose to run a red light. You are a woman who chose to kill Miguel Torres and nearly kill his wife and daughter. And you are a woman who chose to walk away from that destruction without a backward glance, who chose to use your family's resources to delay and obstruct justice. and who chose, even now, even after everything, to show no genuine remorse, no real empathy, no actual understanding of the magnitude of what you've done. Judge Monroe straightened, his presence seeming to fill the entire courtroom. Let me tell you what your family represents. Your father is the governor of this state, and that position comes with great responsibility and great trust. The people of this state trusted him to uphold the law, to serve justice, to ensure that no one, no matter who they are, is above accountability. Your actions haven't just destroyed the Torres family, they've undermined that trust. They've suggested that the law is something that applies to them, but not to you. And your statement here today has confirmed that this isn't just perception, it's exactly what you believe. The judge's voice dropped to something even more dangerous, the quiet certainty of absolute moral conviction. But here's what you've failed to understand, Ms. Ashford. Here's what your privilege and your arrogance have blinded you to. In this courtroom, there is no you and them. There is only the law. There is only justice. And justice, true justice, is the great equalizer that reduces all of us, governors' daughters and ordinary citizens alike, to the same standard, the truth of our actions and the consequences we must face for them. Madison was trembling now, her composure completely shattered, tears beginning to stream down her face. But they looked less like tears of remorse and more like tears of someone finally, for the first time, facing real consequences. You asked me to consider who you are when determining your sentence, Judge Monroe continued. Very well, I've considered it. I've considered that you are someone who killed a man while driving drunk. I've considered that you are someone who destroyed a family and felt no immediate remorse. I've considered that you are someone who used wealth and influence to obstruct justice. I've considered that you are someone who, even when given the opportunity to show genuine contrition, chose instead to display arrogance and contempt. And most importantly, I've considered that you are someone who believes you are entitled to different treatment under law, based solely on your privileged position. The gavel in Judge Monroe's hand seemed to carry the weight of justice itself. Ms. Ashford, this court finds you guilty of vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated, leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death and obstruction of justice. The law provides a sentencing range for these crimes, and the court must consider factors such as remorse, likelihood of rehabilitation, and danger to the community. Your statement here today has made this determination remarkably clear. He paused, and in that pause, Madison Ashford's future, the future she had always assumed, would include yachts and galas and positions of influence, crumbled to dust. Taking into account the severity of your crimes, your complete lack of genuine remorse, your demonstrated belief that you are above the law, and your actions in obstructing justice, this court sentences you to 25 years in state prison for vehicular manslaughter, to be served consecutively with 10 years for leaving the scene and 5 years for obstruction. Total sentence, 40 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving a minimum of 32 years. The courtroom erupted. Madison's legs gave out, and she collapsed into her chair, her face ashen. Governor Ashford stood, his mouth opening to protest, then closing as Judge Monroe's gaze swept toward him. Marcus Pemberton was already calling out about appeals, about excessive sentencing, about judicial overreach, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of Elena Torres sobbing, not with grief this time, but with something that might have been the beginning of healing. Judge Monroe struck his gavel once more, the sound cutting through the chaos. This court believes in redemption, Ms. Ashford. 32 years is a long time, long enough perhaps for you to truly understand what you've done, long enough to learn that every life has equal value, long enough to comprehend that privilege is not immunity, that wealth is not virtue, and that in the eyes of justice, we are all, every single one of us, exactly the same. He looked directly at her, and for just a moment his expression softened almost imperceptibly. I hope you use that time wisely. I hope you emerge from prison as someone different, Someone who understands that being different from them isn't something to aspire to, but something to be ashamed of. Because the moment you start believing you're different, the moment you start believing you're above others, is the moment you lose your humanity. And Ms. Ashford, that's a far greater prison than any cell you'll occupy. As the bailiffs moved forward to take Madison into custody, as her legs buckled and she had to be supported, as Governor Ashford sat with his face in his hands, as reporters scrambled for the exits to file their stories, Judge Monroe sat down slowly, his weathered face returning to its customary expression of calm, judicial authority. But Elena Torres, wheeling herself toward the courtroom exit, paused to look back at him. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and in that moment, something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a recognition that justice, real justice, wasn't about vengeance or victory, but about the simple, powerful truth that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. In the end, Madison Ashford learned what Miguel Torres's family had known all along, that we are all equal in the eyes of justice, that privilege cannot shield us from the consequences of our choices, and that the moment we forget our shared humanity is the moment we lose everything that matters. If this story reminded you that justice should be blind to wealth and status, that accountability matters for everyone, and that true character reveals itself under pressure, do 3 things right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories of justice prevailing, and comment "Justice for All" along with where you're watching from, because stories like this need to be heard, shared, and remembered.